Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, Novembro de 1944. Mist rises from the cold ground, shrouding rows of silenced tanks. The wind blows, making the metal creak as if something alive is breathing within it. Men in white lab coats and wrinkled uniforms observe a secluded platform. In the center rests a 30-meter steel tube pointing toward the horizon. An American general crosses his arms, shaking his head. It's crazy, a cannon that shoots farther than any plane can fly. Useless. Behind him, a slight engineer with greasy hands and feverish eyes silently jots something down. The distant sound of German artillery echoes on the wind, as if mocking that absurd idea. That day, no one believed that this monstrosity would have any practical use. But what they didn't know was that, on that cold morning, we're witnessing the birth of the weapon that would redefine the limits of the impossible. What they didn't know is that the thunder hadn't spoken yet. The project was born not out of necessity, but out of ambition. In 1943, with German V-2s raining down on London, the United States was searching for an antidote, something that would show the enemy that the reach of American engineering knew no bounds. The Army called the project HARP, High Altitude Research Project, but inside the labs, engineers nicknamed it the Insane Cannon. The plan was audacious: to build a cannon powerful enough to launch projectiles 200 kilometers, reaching the edge of space. There was no precedent. No pipe had ever withstood such intense pressures. The first prototype cracked in half on the second firing. The recoil was so violent that it ripped bolts out of the concrete and sent out a shockwave that shattered glass 2 miles away. "This isn't engineering, it's mechanical suicide," noted a skeptical colonel. But for young engineer Gerald Bull, that was just the beginning. He believed that such a weapon could change everything: bomb targets without risk, or even launch satellites without rockets. Months turned into years. Each failure brought laughter from superiors, funding cuts, and reports that ended with the same sentence: project without military merit. But in the hidden workshops of Aberdeen, the sound of blowtorch flames continued. Between twisted steel and ammunition shells, a new version was born. Longer, thicker, more dangerous. No one imagined that this apparent failure carried the seed of victory. In April 1945, the Insane Cannon received its first official test. The target: an isolated desert in New Mexico. Command ordered absolute silence. Not even the newspapers would know. The projectile, a 200-kilogram steel bullet, was loaded with almost religious solemnity. At 6:32 a.m., the electric trigger was activated. The boom shook the ground like an earthquake. The projectile left the barrel at Mach 6 and disappeared. Minutes later, nothing. No impact recorded, no radar signal. The Army concluded the shot failed. The report said, "Flies like a brick, but costs like a plane." Bull was removed from the project. The cannon was decommissioned, its components cut up and stored as scrap. For the officers, the case was closed, another technical fantasy filed away among the delusions of war. And as the Germans surrendered across Europe, the Insane Cannon seemed like an echo of a dying era. 2 years later, a young analyst from the newly created Air Force was reviewing forgotten reports from World War II. Among them, he found something curious: metal fragments found more than 100 kilometers from the 1945 test site. They were the same type of alloy used in the experimental projectile. Somehow the shot had worked. The projectile had simply disappeared, because had flown beyond the radar range of the time. The Army, embarrassed, did not officially reopen the case. But behind the scenes, a new generation of engineers began to look at the project differently. They realized something. Bull's cannon wasn't just a weapon, it was a method of propulsion. The concept would return in the 1950s in smaller versions called Project Babylon and Supergun, funded in secret. The idea: use a colossal cannon to launch satellites, probes, and possibly nuclear warheads without rockets. The impossible became possible. And once again, no one outside the labs knew the monster was breathing again. While the Soviets were testing their R-7 and R-9 missiles, the CIA was intercepting reports about a Canadian-American project being conducted at isolated bases in the Caribbean. a gigantic steel tube buried in the side of a hill. The codename HARP Mk2. In 1962, the experimental cannon fired a projectile at Mach 9, reaching 180 kilometers above sea level. The sound was heard 50 miles away. A Soviet observer, in a confidential report, wrote, "If this is a weapon, it is the thunder of the gods." Suddenly, the world realized that the insane cannon was not a legend. It was a reality and a threat. Satellites could be destroyed. Warheads could cross borders before radar could detect them. The press never found out. The government denied the existence of the project, but engineers who worked in silence described the feeling. The cadence of the 8 cannons sounded like uninterrupted thunder. The air vibrated, as if the earth itself breathed fear. The enemy laughed first, then he fell silent. The insane cannon redefined the American military mindset, even if it was never officially admitted. He taught something vital. Power is not just in destroying, but in imagining what others believe to be impossible. Gerald Bull was invited to secret NATO consultancies and later involved in civilian space projects. But the fate of the man who dared to create the cannon that the army denied would be tragic. In the 1980s, he would resurface, this time working for Iraq, developing the Project Babylon, an even larger version of the cannon. At 150 meters long and with a barrel 2 meters in diameter, it could launch projectiles at 500 kilometers. The weapon was discovered by British intelligence. A few months later, in 1990, Bull was shot 5 times in Brussels. They never found the culprit. "He knew too much," commented a former Canadian agent, "and what he knew did not fit on Earth." With his death, the remains of Project Babylon were destroyed. But the concept, power through technical imagination, remained. Decades later, engineers at NASA and SpaceX would study old HARP reports and recognize something familiar. The ballistic calculations, the pressure simulations, the propulsion models, all anticipated modern reusable rocket launches. The insane cannon never entered combat, but its logic, efficiency, reach, and boldness redefined American technological thinking. At the same Aberdeen base where it all began, the original pipe rusts among weeds and dust. Visitors rarely realize what they are seeing. But if one gets close enough, one can hear the echo of something deep in the air like distant thunder. They laughed when they first saw her. The generals who scoffed at the idea died believing they were right. But the world has changed, and the future of war has changed with it. What was madness became doctrine. What was impossible became science. And the sound that was once called insane became the soundtrack of human supremacy over its own limits. They stopped laughing when they realized that the sound of laughter mingled with the thunder of defeat. The thunder spoke, and the sky was never theirs again.